The first step in collecting and processing native fruits and seeds in the fall is to collect your wild plant material. And here's where you have to know what species you want to collect and the timing of the ripening of the fruits and seeds so that you can go out into the wild and collect them in a timely manner. For example, here's our native winterberry holly. It's easy to tell when these get ripe because they turn red. And anytime they've turned red, they're ready to go. And you can pick the fruits and squeeze out the seeds from the pulp. And you'll get a situation like this where the seeds come out of the pulp. You discard the pulp and you would plant the seeds. And this is done manually by squeezing with your fingers or rubbing between the paper towels to get those seeds out. Now in this case, I've let these seeds harden too much. I did that on purpose so that I could show you what happens if you collect 1 week and then wait 4 weeks for processing. Your fleshy fruits are going to dry out. So try to collect them and then process them within just a few days, and you'll get a lot better results than if you have to pick out your seeds from these dried up fleshy parts. So here's ones that I did 2 weeks ago, and they're nice and separate. These that I'm trying to get out now, it's like cracking open nuts or something. You run the risk of ruining the seeds. So collecting at the right time, keeping the seeds fresh. You can store them in paper envelopes. This is a necessity. You can get big envelopes like this, or you can get small envelopes, coin envelopes. You could use plastic bags. I use plastic newspaper bags, but you do not want to let these sit around or they'll retain moisture and the seeds may rot. So you can put into here your hard seeds, your hickory nuts, your acorns, your buckeyes, just to get them home. But then pretty soon you need to process those seeds because they can't sit around and get dry. Here you can see where in this acorn little beetle larvae have emerged after having eaten the seed. These are no good. Watch for these and try to avoid even getting them. If you do get them, you'll realize pretty soon that it's a waste of time to work with them because the beetles have eaten them up inside. There's one of the beetles right there. See the little beetles in there? Those are beetle grubs. And they've eaten the whole acorn. And that's bad because you've got no seed now. So a certain percentage of your acorns are going to have beetles in them, and that's why you have to collect a lot and plant a lot to get a few good ones to come up. See in there? So collecting and storing properly. For dry seeds, you can pick a pod like this bean pod and let it dry. When it splits open, you'll know that it's ripe. Then you can pick the beans, and what you'll want to do with members of the legume family, whether it's like this coral bean or this Kentucky coffee tree where the seeds are very hard, you'll want to scarify these by rubbing them on sandpaper, putting them in a vise and sawing them with a hacksaw. That's what I would do with the Kentucky coffee bean. Something to break that hard seed coat before you plant. That's important to know. Whenever you're dealing with a legume, read about them and see what you need to do. Mostly these are going to be large to medium-sized seeds. Easy seeds to deal with are things like sweet shrub, silver bell, and other large seeds that you don't have to do much processing to. You just have to plant them. Okay? So this is the collecting of large seeds. Don't let them dry out, and decide what technique you have to use to break dormancy. This is our native sweet shrub, Calycanthus floridus. which occurs throughout the southeast. It's a woodland, shade-loving shrub, forms a little colony, grows in the shade, blooms in the spring with beautiful maroon, sweet-smelling flowers. And then if you're lucky, it'll make these little seed pods. These are dry pods that ripen in the early fall. And if you crack open the seed pod, you'll find a bunch of little seeds in there. You can take those seeds out, plant them in the fall, let them stratify over the winter, and they germinate readily in the spring. You get almost 100% germination. Now in the wild, these things have no way of naturally opening. You noticed I had to pull this one apart. But late in the winter, if you go out and walk amongst your sweet shrubs, you may find some of the pods that have holes chewed in them. This is where little mice, or maybe even birds in the wintertime, have chewed a hole to get to those seeds, and they'll come and take the seeds out and go and eat them and discard some, and you'll get a whole bunch of seeds will come out of these, see? So this is a very good resource for our woodland creatures in the wintertime to eat these sweet shrub seeds. No matter when you collect them, they should germinate and grow readily after 1 to 2 months of cold stratification. Everyone should have a calycanthus in their woodland, or the edge of their woodland, or on the shady side of the house. Don't plant them out in full sun. The seeds are readily germinatable, and these you would consider to be not very large, but large to medium-sized seeds. Very nutritious. These are our native hickories. We have several species in the southeast. Some have very beautiful fall color, like the mockernut hickory. They tend to grow in dryish woods. They tend to be tall and narrow. They tend to be long-lived, and their fall color can be outstanding. So save them if you have them in your woods. They're hard to come by in the nursery trade because they're so slow growing. So if you want to grow some hickories for your woods, you may have to collect the seeds yourselves. So here's a hickory fruit, probably a mockernut hickory. They have a very thick husk. Hickories can be divided into the thick husked hickories and the thin husked hickories. This is a thick one. And from down inside comes the nut. And this nut falls out in early fall, and the seed coat of these hickories are very, very, very hard. And the only way you can get them to germinate is to abrade them with sandpaper or a little hacksaw, make a nick in the seed, or you could sit there and chew on them yourself, or crack them with a hammer. The best way is to go find one that a squirrel has chewed on, because that's what they do. Squirrels chew on hickory nuts, and then they go and bury them and forget about them, and those are the ones that germinate. So very hard nuts, very thick husks, very good fall color, and hard to come by. So you might think about growing a hickory someday. This is our American beech. There's only one species. It grows throughout eastern North America. These are not readily available commercially, so if you want to grow one, you need to collect seeds yourself from the forest in the fall. And not every year is a good year for beech nuts. We have what's called beech mast years, where, say, 1 year out of 3 or 1 year out of 5, beech trees will make a lot of fruits and then hardly any on other years. When they do make fruits, here's what they make. This is a beech fruit, also called a beech nut. It's a triangular nut. It's analogous to an oak acorn. It's in the same family as oak. It's in the beech family. So these are the fruits. There's one seed down inside that will grow into a plant, and 2 of these will be inside of one of these husks. So this husk is like surrounds the fruits, and this husk is analogous to the cap of an acorn or the spiny husk of a chestnut, and so indicating the relationships between oak, chestnut, and beech. They're all in the same family. So collect these nuts as early as you can in the year, stratify them as soon as you can, a certain percentage of them are going to be infected by little beetles that are going to eat them, but a small percentage might germinate in the spring. So collect as many as you can and start them in several different pots. Not too deep, not too wet. See if they'll come up the following spring. American beech. You know, they grow into very large trees, so be sure that you want one before you start growing something that's going to grow into one of the largest trees in the forest. But they are beautiful. These are our native silver bells. We have two species that are usually grown. There are a couple other species in the wild. This is the two-winged silver bell. They make a flat, dry, pod-like fruit, except they don't open up. The seed stays down inside. You can see the two wings here that are created by the fruit wall, and these will deteriorate. They're used for dispersal, but they do deteriorate over time laying out in the woods, and so you could peel these off and you'd have the essence of the seed down inside here. So this is the two-winged silver bell. It's slightly showier than our four-winged silver bell. See the four wings on its fruit. Very much like the two-wing, it's just that the other two wings are a little more pronounced. Both of these species need to be collected any time. They're dry. They can be planted any time in the fall, and they need to be stratified. But the unusual feature that's super important is they take 2 years to germinate. They need a sequence of a cold, moist period followed by a warm, moist period followed by a cold, moist period. So that takes them 2 years in the wild. You could speed that up by putting them in the refrigerator for 2 months moist, take them out for 2 months, put them back for 2 months, then they might germinate earlier. Once germinated, they grow into nice little trees and are fairly easy to grow and make very nice additions to the garden. The two-winged silver bell is a smaller tree with more flowers per unit area, and I like it better. The four-winged silver bell is more of a forest tree, and it quickly grows up to be tall and you don't see the flowers as much. So I prefer to grow the two-winged silver bell. We have 8 species of magnolias in the southeast. Some are more shrub-like, most are tree-like. This is our southern magnolia that makes a fairly large cone, and inside of this cone-like structure are individual little pods where the seeds reside. And here's what's interesting: on the stem of the cone you can see the scars where the sepals and the petals and the stamens all fell off. So that makes them interesting. So you have to get these seeds in September or early October as they ripen, because the birds love them. They're like M&Ms to birds. And the birds will come by and pick them off. They hang out on a little thread, which is their umbilical cord. See that? So they hang out. Birds pick them off as soon as they ripen. And sometimes the best way to get a seed is to pick them up off the ground where the birds have dropped them. So once you pick them up, then you need to clean this fleshy pulp off before it hardens, so you can plant them in the fall, stratify them, and then they'll germinate the following spring. See the big seed down there inside the pulp. All the magnolias work the same way. Some have bigger seeds, some have smaller. Our big leaf magnolia has orange seeds. Most of the other magnolias have red seeds, but they're all interesting to grow and to collect. This is our native sumac. This is winged sumac. We have 4 sumacs here in the southeast, and they all have red berries, and they're all rather tart, and they all spread. So if you decide you want one of these in your garden, beware. They are much better out in a meadow. But the sumacs that have red berries are not poisonous. They're not poison sumac lives in swamps and has white berries. Our non-poisonous sumacs live in dry, meadow-like situations and roadsides and the edge of woods and have red berries. But these berries ripen in the fall. They'll stay through the winter until the birds eat them. But you can collect them. They're semi-fleshy, meaning they're mostly dry. But you can, as they dry, you can squeeze them and get the seed out. See the brown seed in there. And these will germinate after a winter. There's a nice seed. After a winter of cold treatment. Just be careful where you plant them. They spread vigorously. And I have had to eradicate these from gardens where I planted them early on. These are our native sumacs. The best thing to do with the red berries is make sumac aid, like a lemonade. Collect the clusters of berries in late summer or fall, soak them in water inside of cheesecloth bags until your desired level of tartness, and then make a drink out of them. They do have all kinds of little hairs on them, so you might not want to drink a whole lot of those, so you do want to soak them in cheesecloth. These are our sumacs, and birds relish them in the wintertime as a winter food. Okay, next category of seeds you might deal with are those that have a certain amount of fluff on the seeds, or parachutes. Here's the clematis, where you collect the seed head when it's ripe. You can let it dry for a little while. The actual fruits themselves are easy to pick off, and these are easy to just plant. You can plant them directly in a pot of potting soil. You can just throw them in here, cover them with just enough soil to hold them down, or if you got nothing better to do, you can pick off the individual seeds and then put those in, and you won't have these pesky, fluffy parachutes to worry about. Stratify these, and they'll come up in the spring. Similarly, many members of the Asteraceae that have fluffy seeds or parachutes, like this blazing star or liatris, see how the seeds come off and they have their little parachutes. Now if you sneeze on those, they're all going to blow away. This is chaff. So recognize the seed from the chaff. The seeds have the parachutes. Collect these. If you don't like all those parachutes on there, you could rub them between your hands, and you'll rub off some of the parachutes. You'll get stuff stuck in your fingers, but it won't be so bad. I usually just plant those in the pot and cover them with a light covering of soil. And by the way, for covering seeds, you can use coarse sand. Here's some really coarse sand. Now this would be wonderful to cover your seeds because it drains well, but it holds things down. And so you can either mix some of this in the soil, or I just prefer to do it as a top dressing. And your large seeds and your small seeds alike will be nestled down among those grains of sand. So using some coarse, this is almost like aquarium gravel, but a very coarse sand, coarser than sandbox sand, will allow you to hold those seeds down. Okay, so here are the seeds with fluff. You got to collect them. Don't worry too much about the fluff. Get them into a pot, hold them down, set them aside to stratify. Now another situation with members of the Aster family is when you have seeds and chaff. So let's take the little coreopsis here. We've collected this little coreopsis, and it's all nice and ripe. And so you're tearing up each little head with your finger, the ones that are ripe, and you're getting a whole bunch of stuff falling out on the table. And mixed in that is the chaff and the seed. Now this is where seed starting gets interesting and creative. How are you going to separate the seed from the chaff? Well, I know of 3 ways. One way is the tedious way. With tweezers, you pick out the seeds. And of course, obviously they're hard to pick up. And after 10 minutes of work, how many do you have? Depends on how dexterous you are. So that's one technique. A better technique is to take that seed and chaff, put it into a little Tupperware container. There they all are in there. How do you separate the seed from the chaff? The seeds are heavier and the chaff is lighter. And so you learn to gently blow. And as you blow, the chaff blows away. Sure, it messes up your table. You don't want to do this in your kitchen table. You're going to do it outside, or in a greenhouse, garage, storage room. And if you do this enough, you'll eventually blow away most of the chaff, and you'll have mostly seeds left. Another really good way is to get a sieve. So this is a sieve I got at a hardware store, like Ace Hardware Store. And it's got fairly large holes in it. You dump your seed and your chaff into this, and then you shake. And the stuff that comes through the holes, some will be seed and some will be chaff. Now you see, I got all seed and chaff. What does that mean? My holes are too big. The seed and the chaff are about the same size. So you need to work with your sieves and find a sieve that's smaller. So here's a smaller sieve. I'm going to sieve through this. Now you see, do you see any seeds in there? No, it's all chaff. Where are the seeds? They're over here. You separated the most of the seeds from the chaff. So you just need to find the right size holes. Here's a sieve with bigger holes, smaller holes. You can get even smaller holes so that you can separate the seed from the chaff. You can do this with your cardinal flower. You can tap the cardinal flower into the sieve. The chaff is caught by the sieve, and 10 million seeds come through there. I love to do that. And then I should have cleaned off this piece of paper, because now you can take those seeds and put them into an envelope or a jar, or even sow them. And so there's where using little pieces of paper comes out really well. This is our native goat's beard, or Aruncus dioicus. It's a large herbaceous wildflower getting up to 4 or 5 feet tall, actually, with plumes of little white flowers. And they make these little 3-parted seed pods in the fall that ripen. And the way to collect the seeds is collect the little clusters of seed pods, and then as they ripen, they dry out and open up and begin to shed these little 1 millimeter long or 1/16 inch long seeds. You can see how they're coming out. And if you crush them, you'll get more seeds out. But you also get chaff. So there's seeds and chaff. So we'll show you later how to separate the seed from the chaff. See, there's the little elongated seeds, and the rest of this are broken seed pods. But that's the only way you can handle these tiny seeds, is to break up their seed pods sometimes and then sift them through some sort of sifting device to get the tiny little seeds. And then these would be scattered on the surface of soil. You would hardly cover them up. In fact, you wouldn't plan to cover them up when they're this tiny, and let them go through a cold winter stratification. They would germinate abundantly in the spring, and then you would transplant them later. So these are definitely worth growing, because these make very large structural plants in the garden, and their little white flowers are favorites of bees. Another way to deal with chaff or fluff, like here is Joe Pye weed. You see, it's quite fluffy, and so I'll take that and rub it in the sieve. Rub it in the sieve. This is better than rubbing it with your hands. You might even wear gloves, because these do have little prickly pieces that can easily get caught in your skin. Might be irritating to you. And now you've got, here again you're back to, well, you've got chaff and seeds. And so you would have to find a device, another sieve, that might be able to separate those chaffs from the seed. And it's not this one. And so I'll often rub that with my hand to try to break the chaff off, to break off those little parachutes. And then you can blow. You can put it in a little dish. I like these little dishes for blowing. See all the seeds and the chaff in there? Woo, you can blow too hard, and all my seeds went out. So you've got to figure out what your power is and how you're going to deal with this. And in the ultimate situation, you might just take handfuls of this chaff and put it in your pot and put some sand on it and not worry about trying to separate the chaff from the seed. If the seed and the chaff don't separate easily, don't worry about it. Just put them in here. They'll grow. Remember, in nature, these seeds are floating through the air, and they land on the ground. There's nobody there to cover them up, and they're going to germinate where they fall based on what their conditions that they like. And only 1% or less of these seeds are going to fall in a good spot. So you're helping them out a lot by at least putting them in a pot. So you're going to get a better germination than nature does. So your pot, your sieves, your different size holes are all going to give you a variety of ways of sorting through the seeds that have fluffiness. So you've got your big seeds, your smaller seeds that are fleshy that you're going to clean, and then you've got your seeds that you have to separate the seed from the chaff, and you can deal with that. If you have a lot of seeds of something, you can put them in a big container. So here's one of these big baby spinach plastic things that you're not supposed to recycle anymore. Pre-moisten this with good medium. You see how coarse this is? It's got peat and perlite and bark, and I'm not sure I want all these sticks in there, but fairly uniform. Sow your seed in there, and you can cover it up to keep them moist. Set them aside, not in the sun, very important. Don't set your seeds in the sun. If you put your seed pots in a plastic bag to keep them moist, which is not bad, don't put them in the sun. If you use plastic 2-liter soda bottles, you cut the top off of the bottom, use the bottom to put soil, and then fit your top back on there, and you've got a little terrarium. You can do things like that. No matter what you do, the next super most important thing is to label them. So I get inexpensive plastic labels that are going to last 2 or 3 years. If you want them to last longer, you get better labels. You write on here what your seed is, Joe Pye weed. If it's important, you can say when you collected it. If it's important, you can say where you got it. And it's important to put when you germinated it. And you take that label and label your pot. If you don't label your pots, I guarantee you're going to come along next spring when they start germinating, and you won't know what's what. So label, label, label. Some people like to push the label way down. That keeps squirrels from seeing them and allows you to cover this. Some people want a big old label that sticks up. Guarantee you, if you have these outside, squirrels are going to come and dig into these pots, and they're looking for nuts, or they're planting nuts, usually acorns. So cover these with a wire mesh, put them in a bin, put them in a cold frame, put them in your greenhouse, put them on your unheated back porch. Do something to keep them cool. By cool, we mean 40 degrees or less for at least 40 days. Just like, just remember Noah's Ark, 40 days. So 40 degrees for 40 days. You should meet the dormancy requirement for most native plants. Keep your species separate. Don't put two things in the same pot unless you've got really big pots. Label them well. Make sure they stay watered. They can dry out over the winter. And you're off to success next spring. And these things you will learn to live with as you do more and more seed growing, and you'll find it to be a rewarding endeavor. These are our milkweeds. We have many native milkweeds, 30 or 40 species in the southeast. And they all work the same way at seed time. You have a seed pod, which takes several weeks to ripen, and then it opens up, and inside are many individual seeds, each of which has its own little beautiful fluffy parachute. And these are very famous for blowing through the wind and landing. And as they land, the actual seed breaks off from the parachute. So you have a bunch of loose seeds there. Don't try to plant the parachutes with the seeds. Try to get the parachutes off. The best way to do that is to open this pod inside of a paper bag. Do not open it inside of your house, or you'll have these things flying around for a year. Open the pod inside of a paper bag and sort of tweak it a little bit to get the seeds broken off, and then you'll have a bunch of loose seeds that you can plant. You can try to get the fluff outside. The milkweed seeds have to go through a period of cold, moist dormancy that we call stratification, and then they normally germinate in the spring and grow fairly fast. The beauty of these is that these fluffs of seeds make an interesting garden ornament, but you have to get the seeds before the fluff ripens and blows away. Here in the southeast we have several species of native clematis. Most of them are vines, but a few of them are more upright, as is this one. This is our clematis ochroluca, or curly heads. And its single flower makes all of this whole cluster of fruits. And each fruit has its own plume that is a modification of the stigma of the flower. So these ripen during the late summer, and then when they ripen, the wind blows them away, and they blow around and settle down and germinate somewhere the following spring. So these are easy to grow. You just have to collect them before they blow away. And so if you'll notice on all the seed examples we've been talking about, most often than not, I'll say we need to get these species in a timely manner before the seeds blow away. So when the seeds ripen on many of our plants, they don't sit around for very long. So begin to learn the timing of ripening of seeds. This clematis, called curly heads, is a wonderful one. Look at those big seeds there. You can either break the plumes off before you sow them, so they're easier to mess with, or you can just take a handful of them and plant them, and believe me, they'll find their way to come up. They come up in the spring after a period of stratification, and they're not readily available commercially. And so this would be one of the great plants for you to grow yourself from seed, because apparently they're not part of the wildflower menagerie that's grown by any particular growers, and so they tend to be rarer than other types of clematis. This coreopsis, or tick seed, represents a whole group of members of the Aster family who have heads, like all members of the Aster family, with little rays and disc flowers. These are purple disc flowers. And as their heads of flowers ripen, they produce some chaff, and ultimately they'll produce a certain percentage of good seeds. So that's what these are in here, are the seeds of the coreopsis. So you have to crush up these little seed heads and get the chaff and the seeds to come out, and then you can separate the chaff from the seeds and plant the seeds. Now if you planted all of this, that wouldn't be so bad. the chaff is going to dry up, and the seeds are going to germinate after stratification. And so you could, rather than trying to separate all the chaff out, just plant this whole mess of things. What you don't want is too much chaff that might mold or mat down. So you want to get rid of as much as you can of the chaff. Here again, as with all Asteraceae, pick the heads as they're beginning to mature. Don't wait too long. Let them finish ripening in a box or other container, and so that by the time they're ripe, you have all the seeds right there when you tear them apart literally and be able to get the seeds mixed in with the chaff. In the wild, these flower heads fall apart gradually and release a few seeds here and there. But because you want these seeds to grow, you want as many of them as you can get. So you want to bring in a lot of these in the fall. This particular coreopsis is one that ripens in October, but there are summer coreopsis as well. So just learn to be aware of what species you're dealing with, what their seeds look like, when their seeds ripen, when you should collect them. And they all can be treated by stratification and should germinate in the spring. This is rattlesnake master, a native plant that grows in damp places but does very well in a dryish border or pollinator garden. Tall with these large knobby heads that are white during the blooming season. They attract every insect in midsummer when they're in bloom. They're in the carrot family. In the late summer they start making seeds. So these spiny heads, if I do that with my finger, I say ouch, because they have spines on the chaff in there. But as you break the heads apart, you'll see the chaff and the seed falling apart. And what you need is to be able to separate. Here's the chaff. Those have little spines. And then here's the seed. They have a nice seed body with two little prongs on the end. And if you could separate the chaff from the seed, you'll have a pretty prolific set of seeds that germinate very well after a winter of cold. And so rattlesnake master is a very satisfying plant to grow from seed. Collecting the seed, they're not too small, sowing them and hardly covering them up, letting them go through winter stratification, and you'll get some nice little plants that grow fast. These are two of our native gentians of the southeast. Gentians are notoriously difficult to grow from seed and even to grow in the garden because their requirements for a certain moisture regime are more exacting than most plants. But these, I believe, you could have success with. This one is just now finishing blooming in early November. It's called the pine woods gentian. You find it down in the coastal regions in the edges of pitcher plant bogs. And its tiny little seeds are coming out of this little pod. And this is the time of year you would collect those. And then this is one of the bottle gentians. This is Gentiana clausa. It has clusters of blue flowers in late summer, and the flower tubes are closed, hence the name bottle gentian or closed gentian. And the bees that pollinate it have to open up the flowers to get down inside to pollinate. These have slightly larger seeds. So in either case, you've got to be diligent to notice when the flowers are finishing ripening and when the seed pods are fattening, and test one to see if it's got seeds, and then collect them before they shed their seeds, and let them shed their seeds under your care in a little plastic box or a Tupperware dish or a paper envelope, so that you'll be sure to get some of the tiny seeds. Here again, with all tiny seeds, these need to be sown on the absolute surface of the soil where they nestle down in among the nooks and crannies of the soil particles. You don't want to plant too many. The seeds are fine like dust, but try to avoid overplanting. It'd be better to put several shakes, if you will, or pinches of these seeds in different pots so that they're spread out. And you should have no problem with these germinating the following spring. You just have to keep your eye on them. Don't let them dry out while they're growing their first year. So these are our native gentians, highly desirable and hardly ever available commercially. These are our native sunflowers. We have at least 2 dozen in the southeast. They're all rather robust, tall plants. They all have yellow ray flowers, and then clusters of disc flowers in the center. It can be yellow or purple, as other members of the Aster family. But what's nice about the sunflowers is they bloom late in the year, brightly colored, bloom for a long period, and the seeds can be readily eaten by birds. But you do need 2 different mating types to cross-pollinate to get seed. And if you have that, and if you do produce seed, I'm going to tear up one of the heads here to show you the seeds that come out. Now, this is hurting my hand doing this, and I'm not saying ouch. Ouch. I did say ouch. These are where bird beaks come in. The plant is protecting its seeds from animals other than birds that can pick down inside. So now here you see an excellent example of the seeds that are actually fruits. So these are the seeds, and the rest of this is chaff. And the chaff is what you want to separate if you want, pure seed. So you could crush this whole head with the blade at the end of your knife and get all kinds of seeds out of there. These are the true seeds that are going to germinate. And they don't have any kind of fluff on them for dispersal because they are eaten by birds. So one major word of caution: know what species of sunflower you want, because there are 2 kinds of sunflowers. They're the ones that form clumps, and then there are ones that spread vigorously. And you might not want a spreading one, because you might not ever get rid of it. The clumpy ones are much nicer. So know what species you're getting and know what it does before you go to the trouble of growing them from seed. As a general rule, the clumpy ones are going to make seeds much more readily than the spreading ones. So look in a book, find out which does which, and go about collecting seeds. Sunflowers. Okay, this is Liatris, our native blazing star. There are many species of this. They make excellent spiky purple flowers in the garden, usually late summer. This one has heads of flowers, and these turn into fruits. Here are the seeds there, or the fruits. And they each have a little parachute on the top, and that's for wind dispersal. And so this is a representative of all those members of the Aster family, sunflower family, where the seeds, which are also the fruits, have wind dispersal. So that would include things like dandelion and all of the asters and the Joe Pye weed and those kinds of things that make fluffy seed heads. And you collect these when they're ripe. Of course, you got to get them before they all blow away. So that would mean late summer, early fall. And you let these fruits or seeds ripen and fall off. And then you just collect these. You don't try to necessarily get rid of the bristles, but you would plant these thinly in a pot of potting soil, lightly covered, just enough to hold them down. You don't want them too deep, but just enough to hold them down. Remember, the rule is plant no deeper than the seed is thick. And so tiny little seeds like cardinal flower, you plant on the surface. These slightly larger seeds you might plant 1 or 2 millimeters deep, just enough to hold them down. but not too deep. This is our native Lobelia cardinalis, or cardinal flower. Every garden should have as many of these as will fit, because they're so easy to grow, so attractive to hummingbirds. They act as a perennial, but they may not live for more than 2 or 3 years in any one spot, but they seed themselves around with these tiny seeds, and they bloom over a long period of time as the flowers open on these spikes. So you see they make little pods, these little dry seed pods, and like many of the other plants we've talked about that make tiny seed, there'll be an abundance of seeds in those pods. And this is just the act of shaking these a little bit. You get hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds, and you can gather those together and store them in a jar or a paper envelope. And they do not require a long cold period, if any at all. So you can scatter them on the surface. Do not cover them at all. Scatter them on the surface of soil mix, and they'll germinate. The problem is that you'll usually put in too many, and you'll get way too many little seedlings. So try to avoid scattering too many seeds in one pot. Use several different pots, and you'll get oodles of seeds. Okay. This is penstemon, or beard tongue. We have a half a dozen species in the south. They're all wonderful garden plants. Some are more long-lasting than others. Some act as annuals, some as perennials. They all produce a pod, a dry pod, usually with 2 parts. And they dry out as they mature into late summer and into the fall. And to get the seeds out, as before, you pick them early, let the pods dry, and then as the seeds ripen, you can shake them out. And sometimes it's good to crush them. You hear that? It's a hard little seed pod there. So crushing it, seed pod bounced off, and 15 seeds came out. Look at that. Look at that. So you got 1 million seeds there now, and you can tip those into a jar or a paper envelope and collect these seeds and sow them for winter stratification. They have to be stratified. Sow them on the surface of the soil, a coarse textured seed sowing mix, and set them aside, protect them from the elements. But a cold, moist winter, you'll get oodles of seedlings in the spring. Now this is the same sort of situation you would get with many other native plants, shrubs and herbaceous plants, that have little pods and little seeds. Plants such as sweet spire, which is Itea, hydrangeas that you collect in summer, spirea, mountain laurel, sourwood, things like that have tiny seeds and little dry seed pods. You've got to collect them early. If you wait for the seed pods to open in the wild, you may lose half the seed. So pick them before they open, let them dry out, and you'll get lots of seeds. You may have to experiment with this, whether you pick them 1st of September, middle of September, 1st of October. You need to try several times to get the best time to get the most seeds. Okay, as part of our seed starting exercise here, I'm going to show you something even smaller than our smallest seeds. The seeds here of this flowering plant, cardinal flower, you might think are really tiny, and it is one of our smallest seeds. Orchid seeds are smaller, but here are reproductive parts that are even smaller, and these are fern spores. So I'm shaking into the array of cardinal flower seeds some fern spores. You can see that they are like dust. They are certainly the smallest of any of our reproductive units that you can collect and start new plants from. So these fern spores you would collect by picking off dried pieces of fern leaves like this. And on the underside of the fern leaf would be where the spores are produced. You would pick these, put them in an envelope, let them dry. You would collect millions of spores. Then you would shake these very judiciously onto a surface. There again, not covering them up. This just shows you how infinitely tiny fern spores are compared to the seeds of flowering plants. And these fern spores are blowing around in the air everywhere in the earth. They're up in high elevations in the air. They're everywhere. They're on you. You breathe them in. They're on the ground everywhere because they're so tiny. And ferns produce trillions of them, trillions and trillions of these spores. So this just shows you how tiny some things can be and still regenerate life. And that's what's amazing about ferns and plants and other things, is their seeds in the smallest packages, if treated properly, will grow into some of the largest and nicest of our native plants and wildflowers. Okay, these are our wild azaleas. We have 11 species of easily grown wild azaleas in the South. And they're fun to grow from seed because they don't need cold winter period. You'd collect these seed pods while they're still green, actually, before they actually open, like this. And you bring those in, say, September, put them in a little box to dry, and as they dry, the seed pods open up, and then you can shake them, and out will come the seed. If you wait until they open in the wild, you're going to lose the seed. This is a general principle of seed collecting. Look at those coming out of there. Is collect the seeds just before the pods open and bring them in and let them dry in a box or a container. And that way you'll get a lot more seed than if you wait until they open in the wild. This is crucial in your gaining experience about growing seeds from the wild. So here are the individual seeds. Each one has a little wing on the seed. The seeds are not minute, they're small. But each seed has a little wing, and those are blown out by the wind, and often throughout the winter. If they don't all disperse in the fall, they'll blow out throughout the winter, and that's part of their strategy. And it's critical that if you're growing these, that you do not cover them with soil. You sow them on the surface of a peat-based soil mix, which is most soil mixes, a fine textured soil mix. Keep them moist, sow the seeds on the surface, perhaps put them under lights. You could put them in a plastic bag to keep them from drying out, but you don't want them to mold. Keeping them moist, and they'll germinate after a few weeks without cold. That's the beauty of many relatives of azaleas, such as sourwood and mountain laurel and rhododendrons and things like that. They don't need a cold period. Okay, this is black-eyed Susan, representative of this kind of member of the Aster family, such as the coneflowers, the purple coneflower, the orange coneflower, and they all have heads that are fairly stiff. If you mash on them, they don't break. That's because they're made up of chaff. And between these hardened chaff are the actual seeds. So these are the seeds that come out. And these are designed for birds. So a bird like a goldfinch will come sit on the black-eyed Susan or the coneflower, whatever you want to call it, all has different names, and they pick out the seeds as they ripen. And they don't get much each time, but they get a little bit. Same way with thistles. So when you buy a bag of thistles for your bird feeder, you're getting these little seeds that have been separated, the seeds from the fuzzy chaff, so that birds can eat them more readily in many cases. These would be collected, separated from the chaff by sifting or gently blowing the chaff away. Then you scatter these very loosely over the surface of soil, barely covering them, only 1 or 2 millimeters, just enough to hold them in place, and they should readily germinate the following spring. This is the sweet coneflower, Rudbeckia subtomentosa, but all of the coneflowers work in the same way. They all have seeds just like this with no fluff but some chaff. This red sage, or Salvia coccinea, which is native to the deep south and which grows great here in the Carolinas as an annual, is representative of the whole mint family. For the most part, mints form dry pods. These are the sepals. They're not really pods, they're kind of a fake pod, because down inside of those sepals are 4 fruits. They're called nutlets. And as they ripen, the sepal pods dry, and look, the seeds shake out. So after they ripen, every time the wind blows, a few seeds fall out. So this is representative of many, 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 many members of the mint family. So what you would do would be to collect these drying stems after they've bloomed, and maybe put them in a box, lay them in a cardboard box to dry. And as they dry, the seeds come out, and you collect those seeds. See, every time I tap them, a few more seeds. After a while, you get a bunch of seeds, and then you can sow those very shallowly, and some of these will germinate without a cold period. Others may go through the winter and then germinate in the spring. But you can treat almost all members of the mint family in the same way. Collect those little black seeds, and you need to do that by putting these pods into an open container or a paper bag so that you don't lose the seeds as they ripen and fall out. And then they'll keep in a jar for several weeks. You could wait until spring to sow these. Okay, so that's members of the mint family, particularly salvia. Each little set of sepals produces 4 little fruits. They're called nutlets, and they pop out in the wind and blow around a little bit. Birds might eat some of them occasionally, but mostly they just pop out and land near the adult plant. Wonderful and fun to grow.